By now, many of us know Saladin Allah. Saladin is not only a valued speaker here at UUEA, but he's also the lead educator for our Jubilee Kids program. My honest opinion, he's one of the more impressive people I've ever met. What you may not know yet is that Saladin authored 23 books. He is the Director of Community Engagement at Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center, Public Art Project Coordinator at the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area, a member of the United Nations International Civil Society Working Group for the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, and founding director of the Atlantis School for Gifted Youngsters. In today's program, we will examine the legacy of whiteness in America, the role of upstanders, and the importance of centering black voices. Saladin, you may have the podium.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, if you would have kept talking, my head would have been so big, I would have walked out of that door. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate just having this type of opportunity to show up authentically myself. You know, as a black person, a lot of us tend to code switch a lot, where we get around groups of white folks and we change up the way that we talk or how we behave. And I'm thankful to be living in a space and working in a professional space where I authentically am myself. I do not code switch. So that is to say, what I'm going to share with you today is coming directly from here. It's not going to be something tiptoeing around conversations, and some of it is going to be a little uncomfortable too, right? Because these are the type of conversations that we typically don't have on Sunday mornings, right? Usually even in black churches, we're not having these type of conversations on Sunday mornings. So I'm thankful to have this opportunity to be here, to be able to share this subject matter, right? So I'm going to start off, and I think it's important to set a foundation in terms of basic definitions, right? You go to the next slide. So bias, right? Bias is a known inner judgment in favor of or against something conscious or voluntary. And this could be positive or negative, right? Like I'm pretty biased to this type of yogurt that I get from Canada, and it's a Greek yogurt that I love. They only make it in Canada, and I would deliberately go across to Canada just to get that yogurt, right? They don't sell it at Wegmans or nothing like that. So all of us have bias in some type of way. It could be positive or negative. And we also have implicit bias, which are unknown inner judgments, right? So for example, I know some brothers, AKA black men, that may say that they're colorblind, right? And color doesn't mean anything. And, you know, they don't see color. But if you look at their dating history for like the last 20 years, like they've consistently chosen non-black women, right? And if you bring that to their attention, oh no, it's just, I don't see color. But it's like, well, you're kind of like making some involuntary decisions because, you know, these are women that don't live in your community. They're not in your family. They don't work in the same environment as you. So you're making some type of consistent decisions, but you may just not be aware of it, right? I was talking to my oldest daughters recently, and they were telling me that in terms of women who's consistently been in my life, they said that I have a certain type of woman that I'm interested in. They said I have something for crazy women or something. I don't know. But if you ask me personally, like I wouldn't say that, but it's just something that is, I guess, involuntary or implicit. So all of us have implicit bias too, right? Next slide, please. Stereotypes, a widely held idea of a person, place, or thing, and it's typically learned. Like, you know, we learn that, you know, women are into like tall, dark, handsome men, and that has some truth to it, I can tell you from personal experience. But it also is a very stereotype that in a lot of ways may not be true, right? And all of us have certain type of stereotypes, right? Maybe a month or so ago, we had like a potluck dinner, and I'm gonna tell you, when I came in and I looked at the soup, I was wondering if it was gonna be seasoned, you know, or is it gonna be a different type of like white people soup, right? But I tried it and I'm like, oh, okay, this is good, right? So that's a stereotype that I brought into this space, right? And that's something that we all are subject to, right? Next slide, please. Prejudice, inner negative judgment without knowledge of that person, place, or thing, and that is also learned. You know, so we all have prejudices. We all prejudge something to begin with, right? I know you saw some of the news with some of the moves that the Bills have made. And some of us saw that and we prejudged what that's going to look like next season. And we really don't know for a fact what is going to be the outcome of that. So all of us are subject to prejudice. Next slide, please. Discrimination. The unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things. And now we're getting into an area where we're talking about power and influence. Like everyone doesn't necessarily have the ability to discriminate, right? For example, some of the nightclubs downtown Buffalo, there's a big list when you go to some of these clubs and it says no hats, no Jordan sneakers, no braids, no thick nostrils where you're going to breathe most of the air in this environment, like just a whole bunch of just crazy descriptions. And it's no different than some of the signs that we've seen years ago where they just were up front and said no Chinese people, no Jewish people, no women, no black people, right? But it's kind of changed a little bit, but it's the same type of thing to discriminate against specific groups of people, right? Next slide. Racism, the systemic and institutionalized misuse and abuse of power, and I bolded power, right? Because a lot of times people think, oh, black people can be racist too. Well, I don't know, maybe in an African country or something like that, where that represents the dominant masses of people. But in a place where you have a segment of the population that literally has no power in terms of controlling the economy or the institutions or the resources, they don't necessarily have that ability to misuse and abuse power, right? But when you're in an environment where you have people who are connected to institutions and are connected to controlling resources and an economy, you can see those abilities to create racism, sexism, ageism, all of the isms, right? But it's always connected to people in positions of power, or it's from an institutionalized perspective, right? Next slide, please. So when you look at it, bias, implicit bias, prejudice, stereotype, that can be individualized, right? All of us have those different type of things that are going on in us, whether it's positive or negative. But then when you get into discrimination and racism, you're talking more of a group concept, right? Where we're talking about positions of power and influence. And they utilize those positions of power and influence to carry out stereotypes or prejudices or bias or implicit bias. Next slide. So where did whiteness come from? Next slide. So these are old pages from Virginia Assembly law that was passed in 1691. It was called the Suppression for the Outlying of Slaves. And I always show people this because this was the first time that white or whiteness was codified in a legal context. Now what I mean by that is people kind of colloquially use the word white, but it wasn't codified in a legal document yet until 1691. Next slide. And this, on April 1691, Virginia's General Assembly passed the Act of Suppressing Outlying Slaves, granting county sheriffs, their deputies, and any other lawful authority the ability to kill any enslaved person resisting, running away, or refusing to surrender themselves when ordered to do so. This is the first time that the word white was used and codified in a legal document. So when slavery first started in this country, it wasn't as organized as we saw it become in generations. Initially, people had to kind of figure out how to regulate things. And one of the first things that they noticed is they had to figure out how to regulate enslaved people who were off of the plantation. As long as you're on a plantation, we can actually control you and your comings and goings. But once you're outside of the parameters of a plantation, like we don't really have the ways to regulate that. And one of the things that started to become a real issue is miscegenation. Enslaved people forming relationships with other people outside of the parameters of the boundaries of the plantation. So this is why they actually created this law, right? Next slide. Part of the law actually says, and for the prevention or abominable mixture and spirituous issue which herefore may increase in this dominion, as well as by Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians intermarrying with English or other white women, and this is when it was first used in the context of a woman, a white woman, as by their unlawful accompanying with one another, be it enacted by the authority as foresaid, and it is hereby enacted, that for the time to come, whosoever English or other white man or woman, being free, shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian, or a woman bond or free, shall within 3 months after such marriage be banished. That's a harsh word, banished, right? And removed from dominion forever, right? So this is the first time when you're thinking about whiteness, how it's actually being defined within the context of relationships, right? And here's the problem. Any of you who define yourself as white, this is something that you all inherited, just like I inherited just the idea of what it means to be black. It's not any of our fault individually or personally right now, but it is our responsibility in order to redefine what that actually is, or even if we want to use it, right? Next slide, please. An act for suppressing outlying slaves was rooted in restricting race mixing and punishing white people for participating in it. They were banished from the colonies forever. If a white woman had a child who was she was forced to pay 15 pounds of silver to the church. If she defaulted, she would be a servant to the church for 5 years and then sold. So that's a nice way of saying you enslaved to white woman, right? The child would be enslaved to the church for 30 years. So when they're using the word church, these are not churches that are extinct today. This is a legacy of churches that still exist to this day, but they're not having this conversation Sunday morning, right? Matter of fact, they're probably never having that type of conversation because that is their legacy, right? But this is how that idea of miscegenation was being treated, and they had to regulate that right from the beginning. But that set into motion many other aspects of what we started to see in this country,